In 2024, Drake filed a lawsuit against Universal Music Group alleging artificial streaming manipulation and algorithmic rigging. 6 years earlier, Kanye West said the exact same thing on camera. They called him paranoid. In 2013, he stood inside Harvard and warned that record deals were designed to strip artists of ownership. They called it a rant. Years later, Taylor Swift's Masters dispute made that same argument impossible to ignore. Kanye predicted nearly everything about how this industry actually operates, and nobody listened, not because he was wrong, but because the systems he was exposing had every reason to discredit him first. The question isn't whether he was right, it's what it cost him to be early. On November 17, 2013, Kanye West stepped into a packed lecture hall at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. The invitation came from the African American Student Union, but the moment that unfolded was anything but routine. Kanye stood at the front, not as a performer, but as someone intent on warning a new generation about the invisible contracts shaping creative life. He said, "I really do believe that the world can be saved through design, and everything needs to actually be architected." But beneath the talk of architecture, he turned to something more urgent: ownership. He told the students, "When you sign a music deal, you sign away your rights. Without the masters, you cannot do anything with your own music. Artists have nothing except the fame, touring, and merch." The words landed quietly in the room, but outside those walls, the reaction was anything but thoughtful. Within a day, headlines called it a publicity stunt. Boston Magazine described the visit as a thoughtful conversation, but could not resist implying it was about self-promotion. Rolling Stone listed it among a series of rants. The Harvard Gazette simply called it an impromptu visit, offering no analysis at all. The underlying message, the reality that signing a standard record deal often means losing control over your own work, was brushed aside. Instead of sparking debate about the economics of music or the power of contracts, coverage focused on Kanye's delivery, his tone, and whether he was seeking attention. In that 5-minute appearance, Kanye laid out a blueprint for understanding the modern music industry: the artist as a public face, the label as the true owner, and the contract as the silent engine stripping away rights. At the time, these warnings were dismissed as the latest in a string of unpredictable outbursts. There was no serious contract analysis, no follow-up from industry leaders. The idea that an artist could be famous yet powerless over their own catalog was treated like a punchline. Yet as the years would prove, the issues Kanye raised that day would become central to some of the most high-profile disputes in music. But in 2013, the warning was clear, and almost nobody wanted to hear it. In the summer of 2019, the music industry's hidden machinery was forced into public view when Taylor Swift revealed she had lost control of her master recordings. Her label, Big Machine Records, had sold her entire catalog to Scooter Braun, a move Swift described as a betrayal. She posted online that for years she had asked and pleaded for a chance to own her work. The story dominated headlines, turning the question of artist ownership from an insider's concern into a mainstream controversy. Suddenly, primetime news and morning talk shows were explaining what a master is and why it matters. Artists, fans, and journalists debated whether a star as powerful as Swift could really be powerless over her own music. In the following months, op-eds in The Guardian and the BBC dissected the issue. They used language that had once been dismissed as overblown, likening record contracts to modern-day slave ships, and describing the label's leverage over artists as a form of control that persists long after the spotlight fades. But missing from these columns was any mention of who had first sounded the alarm. The core critique that fame, touring, and merchandise are distractions from the real power of owning masters was now being repeated almost word for word, but the source was conveniently forgotten. Industry panels in 2020 framed the debate as a new awakening, as if the problems had only just come to light. The same executives and commentators who once rolled their eyes at talk of invisible contracts now spoke with urgency about the need for reform. Yet, The blueprint had already been laid out years earlier by someone the industry had dismissed as incoherent or self-absorbed. The difference was not in the argument, but in who was allowed to make it and who was allowed to be taken seriously. As the Taylor Swift case unfolded, it became clear that the real issue was not just about ownership, but about who gets credit for raising hard truths. The industry's sudden embrace of artist rights was less a change of heart than a shift in optics. The same warnings that were once treated as punchlines had become respectable talking points, so long as they came from the right mouths. In this new narrative, the original messenger was left out of the story, even as the world finally began to listen. On November 18, 2016, the St. Pablo tour ended without warning. The official line was that it was for personal reasons, but the details quickly slipped out. Kanye West had been hospitalized in Los Angeles for a psychiatric evaluation. Within hours, the story was not just news, it was entertainment. Late-night hosts mined the incident for punchlines. Jimmy Fallon joked that it looked like Kanye had finally decided to take a break from reality. Stephen Colbert joked about a new album called Hospital Free. Jimmy Kimmel compared the tour to a psychiatric unit. The cycle was relentless. Each joke turned a private crisis into a running gag. Tabloids speculated, but they were not alone. Major outlets and social media joined in, framing the moment as another episode in a long list of meltdowns. The dominant narrative was not about pressure, exhaustion, or the toll of life under constant scrutiny. It was about spectacle. The public's appetite for drama left no room for understanding, only for amusement and judgment. Kanye's own words about what happened came later. He spoke openly about being diagnosed with bipolar disorder, refusing to hide or minimize it. In interviews for his 2018 album, he called it his superpower, pushing back against the idea that a mental health diagnosis should be a source of shame. He described being handcuffed and medicated not as a cautionary tale, but as the reality of living with a condition that millions share. At the time, these admissions were met with skepticism. Critics dismissed them as damage control or another publicity move. The idea that a major artist could talk about mental health without being defined by it seemed almost impossible. Yet the conversation did not stop with Kanye. In 2019, Kid Cudi credited Kanye's openness as the moment that made it possible for artists to speak honestly about depression and anxiety. Naomi Osaka, after withdrawing from the French Open in 2021, pointed to the same moment as a turning point for athletes. She wrote that it is okay not to be okay, echoing the words that Kanye had already brought into the public arena. The stigma began to crack, not because the industry changed overnight, but because the silence had been broken. A review of music coverage before and after November 2016 shows a shift. Where mental health was once framed as eccentricity or weakness, it started to be discussed as advocacy and survival. The numbers bear this out. By 2023, over 40% of surveyed artists reported having experienced a mental health crisis in the past year. More than a quarter cited Kanye's hospitalization as an inspiration to speak up themselves. But in 2016, the story was still about ridicule. The industry, the media, and the public treated a mental health emergency as just another episode in the ongoing reality show of celebrity. The real warning about the costs of ignoring psychological strain in entertainment was buried beneath the laughter. Only later, after others began to echo his honesty, did the conversation start to change. By then, the headlines and the punchlines had already done their work, reinforcing the pattern. Speak out, get mocked, and wait for the world to catch up. Long before it became a debate on news panels or a trending hashtag, Kanye West described a cycle that would come to define his public life. He laid it out in interviews and offhand remarks, but the pattern was always there. Say something that challenges the system, get labeled unstable, and watch as the conversation shifts from the issue to the person. In a 2013 radio interview, he spelled it out step by step: controversial statement, unstable tag, mental health speculation, business pressure, and finally, isolation. This was not a personal complaint, it was a map of how the industry protects itself. The machinery works quietly at first. A provocative comment about contracts, streaming, or creative control gets repeated in headlines. Instead of examining the claim, coverage pivots to tone, delivery, and intent. The unstable label starts to appear, not as a diagnosis, but as a shorthand to make the real critique disappear. Editors and producers lean on the same language: meltdown, rant, publicity stunt. Leaked editorial memos from outlets like TMZ have even instructed staff to emphasize mental health speculation when artists challenge industry norms. The label serves a purpose. Once someone is branded unpredictable, their arguments can be dismissed without discussion. Business pressure follows close behind. The moment the unstable narrative takes hold, contracts come under review, partnerships stall, and endorsement deals evaporate. Internal documents from corporate partners like Adidas and Gap show how morality clauses and brand safety reviews can be triggered by public controversy, regardless of the substance behind it. The artist becomes a liability, and the industry moves to protect itself. Radio blackouts and venue bans are enforced quietly, but the effect is unmistakable. Isolation, both economic and social. This is not just about Kanye. Other artists have described the same pattern, but his case is the most visible. The unstable tag becomes a shield for the industry, deflecting scrutiny from the structures he has called out. It is a playbook that keeps uncomfortable questions off the table. When Kanye warned that streaming numbers could be manipulated or that fashion partnerships could be revoked overnight, the response was never a debate about facts. It was speculation about his state of mind. Over time, the cycle repeats. The original warning gets buried under layers of ridicule and concern trolling. The system stays intact, and the person who tried to expose it stands alone. Years later, when lawsuits, leaked memos, or new voices confirm the substance of the critique, the narrative rarely circles back to the dismissed messenger. The unstable playbook has already done its work. Through this lens, every later chapter, whether it is about money, charts, fashion, or branding, can be traced back to the same machinery. The question is no longer just what Kanye said, but why the world was so eager to discredit him before listening. On February 14, 2016, The Life of Pablo appeared not on every streaming platform, but as a Tidal exclusive. Kanye West had just aligned himself with a service owned by artists, promising a different kind of release, one that would, in his words, change the game. The move was immediately called reckless. Pitchfork described it as self-destructive. The Verge labeled it desperate, and op-eds painted the decision as a last-ditch effort to grab headlines. Yet, the underlying question, why would an artist of Kanye's stature limit his own reach, went largely unasked. Beneath the headlines was a protest against streaming economics. At the time, Tidal paid artists about 1.2 cents per stream, nearly double the rate offered by Spotify and Apple Music. Kanye's decision was not just about exclusivity or branding. It was a pointed response to the way major platforms diluted artist compensation, pooling royalties, and distributing them in ways that favored the largest labels and the most heavily promoted acts. By choosing Tidal, Kanye forced the conversation toward fairness and control, even as critics focused on inconvenience and spectacle. The backlash was swift. Fans expressed frustration over access, but industry voices were sharper. They accused Kanye of holding his own music hostage, of misunderstanding how digital distribution worked. Few acknowledged the reality. Streaming platforms had become the new gatekeepers, deciding not only who gets paid, but how much. The Life of Pablo's rollout was messy, but the message was clear. Kanye saw streaming as another system rigged against creators, a digital contract that echoed the old record deals he had warned about years before. Congressional hearings years later would cite The Life of Pablo as a case study in artist-label power imbalance. When the Federal Trade Commission reviewed anti-competitive behavior in streaming, Kanye's Tidal protest was referenced again. But in 2016, these concerns were drowned out by mockery and accusations of erratic behavior. The substance of the protest, how artists are compensated, who controls the platform, and who gets to set the rules, was buried beneath the noise. Only after the dust settled did the industry begin to reckon with the questions Kanye had forced into the open. By 2022, the debate over streaming royalties had moved out of the margins and into the center of public policy. What once sounded like a far-fetched complaint, platforms extracting value from artists while paying fractions of a cent per stream, became the subject of industry panels, government hearings, and news investigations. Spotify's payout model, for years defended as the future of music, landed under scrutiny as artists revealed just how little even millions of streams could earn. Reports from the Ivors Academy and the Musicians Union in the UK calculated that it would take over 1 million Spotify streams to match the monthly minimum wage. In the United States, hearings before the House Judiciary Committee and the Senate Commerce Committee in 2022 and 2023 featured testimony from songwriters, label executives, and digital rights activists. The phrase streaming justice appeared in official transcripts, and lawmakers pressed for answers on why the biggest platforms kept royalty calculations so opaque. Spotify's own transparency reports, published in response to mounting pressure, admitted that the average per stream payout hovered around $0.003. The company's pro rata system pooled all subscription revenue, then distributed it largely to the most played tracks, an approach that left smaller and independent artists with a shrinking slice of the pie. In 2023, a leak revealed that major labels, not the artists themselves, received the bulk of these payments, with contracts often passing only a fraction along to the creators. The same year, a payment scandal erupted when artists discovered delayed or missing royalties, sparking public calls for regulatory oversight. #BrokenRecord and #Justice at Spotify trended as musicians demanded a fairer deal. Congressional proposals, including the Federal Music Transparency Act, began to echo the same concerns Kanye had raised years before, that hidden algorithms and backroom deals controlled who got paid and how much. Policy drafts called for open accounting, minimum royalty guarantees, and anti-payola enforcement. The Music Business Association, once dismissive of artist complaints, now cited the need for structural reform in its official statements. Even the Federal Trade Commission referenced the Tidal exclusive as a case study in anti-competitive conduct, highlighting how platform design could tip the scales against creators. Within a decade, the core warning that streaming platforms and their payout structures were engineered to benefit everyone but the artist had gone from fringe theory to a legislative talking point. The same arguments once dismissed as self-serving or delusional were now at the heart of public policy. The industry's defense had shifted from ridicule to reluctant reform, but the underlying blueprint had been there all along. In 2018, Kanye West turned his attention to the hidden machinery behind the streaming era. He did not talk about low payouts or the economics of royalties. He went further, naming the tools that drive what people hear and what gets left behind. In a series of public statements, tweets, and interviews, he accused the industry of using bots to rig streaming numbers, buying playlist placements, and manufacturing chart success. He called out what he saw as a new form of digital payola, where algorithms and cash, not talent or fan demand, decided who rose to the top. On social media, Kanye's language was blunt. He warned that bots were rigging streams, that playlists were being bought, and that artists were being paid for nothing. In a televised interview, he described a system where labels and platforms could inflate play counts with automated clicks, then charge artists and their managers for a shot at the most influential playlists. The charts, he said, were not a reflection of real listeners, but the outcome of a closed system controlled by those with the deepest pockets and the right connections. The response was immediate and predictable. Major music outlets ran headlines framing his claims as the latest in a series of self-serving rants. Critics called it paranoia. Industry insiders dismissed the accusations as the product of ego or a lack of understanding about how streaming really worked. The idea that bots and backroom deals could shape the charts was treated as a conspiracy theory, something too wild to be taken seriously. The focus shifted from the substance of the accusation to the supposed instability of the messenger. That same year, a Norwegian newspaper uncovered evidence that Tidal, one of the platforms at the center of the debate, had been accused of inflating play counts for major releases. Billboard and other chart compilers began announcing new measures to weed out artificial streams, and music business analysts started asking whether playlist placement had become the new payola. But even as these stories broke, Kanye's original warnings were left out of the conversation. The narrative remained he was acting out, not blowing the whistle. Underneath the ridicule, the real issue was clear. If bots and paid placements could decide which songs topped the charts, then the promise of the streaming revolution, a direct connection between artist and listener, was a myth. The gatekeepers had not disappeared, they had just gone digital. Kanye's accusation was not about personal grievance, it was a challenge to the legitimacy of an entire system, and the industry's swift dismissal only highlighted how uncomfortable that truth really was. In 2024, a federal complaint landed in the Northern District of California, filed by one of the most commercially successful artists of the era, Drake. The defendant was Universal Music Group, the world's largest record label. The language in the lawsuit was clinical, but the charge was explosive. Drake's legal team accused Universal Music Group of systematic artificial inflation of streaming numbers, naming bot farms, algorithmic steering, and covert payments for playlist placement. The complaint described the creation of fake user accounts, millions of phantom streams, and a system that quietly tipped the scales in favor of selected tracks. Paragraph after paragraph, the filing laid out a vision of an industry where the charts were manufactured, not earned. The specificity was striking. Drake's lawyers called out algorithmic steering of listeners, payola to playlist curators, and the creation of false user accounts. These were not vague accusations. They mirrored, almost word for word, the warnings Kanye West had delivered 6 years earlier, warnings that were met with ridicule and labeled as evidence of instability. In 2018, Kanye had said on air, "They use bots to pump numbers for artists they favor. They control playlists and pay for placement, making the charts a manufactured product." At the time, those claims were brushed aside as another outburst. Now, nearly identical language appeared in a formal legal brief with the full weight of a superstar's legal team behind it. The contrast could not be sharper. When Kanye described a system built on artificial streams and algorithmic bias, the response was mockery, headlines about paranoia, speculation about his mental health, and a refusal to engage with the substance of his critique. But when the same accusations appeared in a court filing from Drake, complete with legal citations and forensic evidence, the industry could not laugh it off. The complaint forced executives, journalists, and regulators to confront the possibility that the charts, the payouts, and even the public's sense of what is popular might be engineered behind the scenes. The lawsuit's timing was not lost on those who remembered Kanye's earlier statements. In the years between his public accusations and Drake's legal action, streaming platforms had quietly introduced new fraud detection systems. Chart compilers like Billboard announced reforms to weed out artificial activity. Congressional hearings and Federal Trade Commission reports began to reference algorithmic manipulation as a real concern. But the original messenger, the one who had mapped out the machinery in plain language, was left out of the official story. This was the moment when the pattern became impossible to dismiss. What had once been written off as delusion or self-interest now appeared as a blueprint for understanding the digital music business. The legal language, the forensic audits, the regulatory attention, all of it arrived years after the warning. The only thing missing was acknowledgement of who saw it coming. In 2009, Kanye West stepped into European luxury fashion with a plan that most insiders found easy to dismiss. He took a $500 a month internship at Fendi in Rome, working alongside Virgil Abloh. Their days were filled with errands and paperwork, far from the creative rooms where real decisions happened. The fashion press treated the whole thing as a joke. Elle quipped that neither intern did anything of value, reducing their efforts to a celebrity sideshow. That same year, Kanye launched Pastel, his own ready-to-wear label. The rollout lasted just 2 days before the project was abruptly shelved. Headlines focused on how quickly it disappeared, with New York Daily News framing the collapse as a spectacle. Within the industry, the message was blunt. Hip-hop didn't belong at the luxury table. Anna Wintour, then the most powerful editor in fashion, later called Kanye's designs novelty items, not serious fashion. Invitations to couture shows quietly vanished. Major outlets either ignored his work or offered faint praise laced with skepticism. The silence from gatekeepers wasn't just about taste. It was a refusal to accept that street culture and hip-hop could shape luxury. For years, the fashion world borrowed the energy, but kept the architects at a distance. Kanye's ambition was treated as a misunderstanding of the rules. Nearly a decade later, the script flipped. In 2018, Virgil Abloh, once Kanye's fellow intern, became men's artistic director at Louis Vuitton, the first black designer to hold the role. In 2023, Pharrell Williams took over at Chanel, a house that once kept hip-hop at arm's length. Streetwear, once excluded, now set the tone for luxury. The same world that mocked Kanye's early efforts scrambled to claim the movement he helped spark. Runway shows and collaborations replaced old resistance. The original skepticism faded, replaced by a new reality. The culture once dismissed had become the blueprint. The irony lingered. What was once a punchline became the business model. Adidas and Kanye West built one of the most profitable partnerships in sneaker history, but the balance of power was always precarious. For years, Kanye warned that artist and brand deals turn creators into dependent contractors. In interviews as early as 2016, he described the risk. The designer becomes the face, but the company holds the keys. If a sneaker brand owns your name, you lose the ability to dictate your own aesthetic. He called out the illusion of creative freedom, insisting that corporate contracts can strip away control with a single clause. That warning became reality on October 25, 2022, when Adidas terminated the Yeezy partnership with immediate effect. The company's press release was unambiguous. Adidas declared it was the sole owner of all design rights to existing products as well as previous and new colorways under the partnership. Overnight, the brand stopped all payments to Kanye and his companies. The entire Yeezy operation, built on Kanye's celebrity and creative vision, now belonged to Adidas, down to the last silhouette and future colorway. The timing was not accidental. Adidas acted on its own schedule, invoking a termination clause that allowed the company to cut ties the moment Kanye's public behavior was deemed a risk to the brand. There was no negotiation, no attempt to salvage the collaboration. The decision was unilateral, enforced by the contract language Kanye had warned about years earlier. Financial filings revealed the scale of what was lost. Adidas projected a short-term hit of up to 250 million euros for 2022 and unsold. Yeezy inventory was written down by hundreds of millions more. But the real lesson was in the mechanics. The partnership's value could be erased and the designer's role erased with it by a single boardroom decision. Kanye's original critique was not about fashion or even about himself. It was about the structure of power inside the contract. When the partnership suited Adidas, Yeezy was a cultural phenomenon. When the risk outweighed the reward, the company invoked its rights and moved on, leaving the creator with no leverage and no recourse. The episode exposed the truth behind the brand and artist relationship. Loyalty is conditional, and control always belongs to the one who writes the contract. The cost of speaking ahead of the curve is measured in more than headlines or lost contracts. For Kanye West, validation always seemed to arrive late, long after the damage had been done. The cycle played out with a kind of ruthless precision, a warning, the backlash, then years later, the quiet adoption of the very ideas that drew ridicule in the first place. By the time the world caught up, the penalty had already been paid. Public ridicule became part of the price. The label of instability stuck, even as industry leaders and lawmakers began to echo his language about ownership, streaming, and control. When artist rights became a mainstream cause, the original messenger remained on the outside, his credibility already eroded by years of mockery. Lost leverage wasn't just about dollars or deals, it was about being disqualified from the debate, no matter how accurate the critique. The industry, meanwhile, had everything to gain. By dismissing the messenger, it bought time to adapt, rebrand, and eventually claim the reforms as its own. Corporate statements and legislative proposals repeated Kanye's arguments almost verbatim, but the instability tag stayed with him. The reforms arrived, but acknowledgement did not. Vindication proved hollow. There was no restoration of lost opportunities, no erasing of the stigma that followed every so-called outburst. In the end, being right did not mean being made whole. The pattern was clear. The system could absorb and profit from the truth, so long as it first rendered the truth-teller expendable. Justice and vindication turned out to be very different things. In an industry built on image, questioning the system is treated as madness, until the system itself confirms the warning. Today, artists fight for ownership and transparency in battles Kanye flagged years before anyone cared to listen. The real story isn't about celebrity, it's about who decides what's credible and why. Sometimes, the loudest voices are silenced, not because they are wrong, but because they threaten power. Whose truth gets heard next? Let's keep that conversation going in the comments.